McMark. I've got a cool one for you. This new company, Ray AR, is making augmented reality glasses for the masses. Hey, look at that. I'm a poet, and I didn't even know it. They asked for help with a proof of concept video that features point-of-view footage of situations where the glasses come in handy. They'd like the UI to be tracked in and overlaid to mimic what the actual experience will be like. There are 3 shots and the graphics are already designed for you. The final shot needs a little kiss of love, something cool on the lenses, and you can pick which of the 3 provided logos works best for you. Just add the URL in a nice font underneath. Thanks in advance.
Hey, what's up? If you live in the... Hey, what's up? No. Hey, what's up? Shit. Hey, what's up? Hey, what's up? If you live in the Bay Area, this is the kind of job you will see. We've got a piece of technology, and what actually is the content, they don't know. They're all about the glasses. Let's take a look at what they've mocked up. To get things started, I've pulled everything in from Premiere Pro as well as the design elements and organized them. Here's a preview.
Your own private tour guide, coming soon.
And then the elements I've organized underneath the reference for each of them. So here's the first running shot and its elements. These, of course, are all with Alpha Channel. They originally came in as Illustrator, and what you can do is right-click and choose Replace with Layered Comp. Can't do it with that one because that's one of my bottom-level layers. But these top-level ones that contained these sub-layers allow me to re-import as comps like that. And then here is cooking and traffic. So a heck of a lot is already done for me here. And most of my work is going to be tracking and integration. Now, if I were in your shoes, I'd be feeling a little nervous about this one. Future UIs can be very detailed and have a lot of minute timing and precision issues, and you have to come up with ideas about how things are going to work in a world that doesn't exist yet. Or you can take the less is more approach, which is what I'm going to do here. In the real world, what I've found is for these types of jobs where it's promoting a certain type of technology where they want a fantasy UI, you want the UI to stay out of the way a little bit. And I'd say that's also the case with AR. Now, we're in the early days of augmented reality interfaces, but we've already seen send-ups of what a nightmare they are if you let them get out of control.
Apúrate si quieres una buena calificación.
Voy lo más rápido que puedo.
¿Has pensado en correr? Es saludable y eficiente.
So, for the most part, I'm going to be taking a constrained approach to the animation of the UI and really focus here on where it's placed and how it's integrated with the motion of the shots. We are going to kick things off with this shot by immediately just deploying Track Camera. The blue bar that's displayed tells us the camera tracker is analyzing pixels in the scene. You can do this in the background for cases where it's going to take several minutes and you want to go work on another comp. It tracks often hundreds of points as their position and scale change over time, and any one point may only be tracked for a few frames. The basic assumption is that the scene is mostly static, but the camera itself is continually moving through space, and that can be precisely recreated as an animated After Effects 3D camera. What we get are these little markers, which I can make larger. And I'll do that for a moment just to easily show you that they do scale over time. So not only do they get larger or smaller according to how close to camera they are, but as they move closer to camera, in this case, they are getting larger. The first thing we want to do, and this is usually the case, is to pick somewhere to set effectively a null, but most of the time we do that with a solid. And in this case, I'm going to be putting elements all up and down this street, and I think I want this area right in here to be my main one. Now my target looks enormous, so I can adjust the target size downward. I'm going to bring it down to like 30%. That's a bit better. We could even go down to 20. That looks good. And that looks basically like it's laying on the ground. Right there is good. I can also select a set of points that I think are good, and it'll hold those. Now the first thing I'm going to do is set ground plane and origin to this point. Setting the ground plane and origin as a first step is telling After Effects a couple of things. One, I've found something that is the ground plane, and that is the street in this case, and I'm right on top of it. And also I've found the center of my scene, which in 3D is going to be 0, 0, 0. In that same place, I'm also creating the camera and a solid. And that solid, if we take a look, is going to be right at 0, 0, 0. And the camera is not only going to move around that point, but it's now going to become the basis to add other 3D elements in other areas of the scene. I can straighten it out a little bit because this is going to become my reference point. So that's not what I wanted to do. These targets are very particular. They're tight, they're small when you're trying to hit. So what I'm doing is with the rotate control, I'm just going for the Z axis right there. Just adding that 0, 0, 0 point at the center of the 3D universe that I'm creating and having that nice solid that I can see to mark it is great, because in case you hadn't noticed, After Effects, unlike 3D programs that are dedicated to 3D animation, lacks things like grids. It has orthographic views, but it's really difficult to kind of measure where things are. The next extra step that I'm going to take, that's not necessary but really helpful, is going to be, while I'm still in the tracker, to create a few more solids using the points I created, and those are going to be roughly in the places where I want the other elements to go. That way, I don't have to guess how far from 0 they need to be. So let's call this one crosswalk 2, and I'll add another one in the first crosswalk over here. I need my pointer key again. That looks good. Create a solid there. Call that crosswalk 1. And then, yep, like magic, that one's working too. Now one thing I didn't point out here, let's just take one quick look. The average error when I tracked was 0.71, and that's under these advanced controls. That's pretty darn good. Average error is measuring inconsistency between the points as After Effects builds up a model of the scene. And one thing that will definitely throw off the average error is a moving object. Now, we have some moving objects in the scene. If I scale up the points and zoom in, you can see some cars moving way down the street, and there are tracking points on them. And I could have deleted those points, and that is something you'll see me do in the other shots. But for now, anything below 1, well below 1.0, is a really good track, and honestly deleting those points probably isn't going to make a huge difference in this case, since it really looks like these are sticking quite well. I have a number of objects, if you remember, to set in here, so let's just take a look at those. We've got my crosswalk, parking spaces, a detour sign, and this coffee sign. So I'm thinking we're going to go coffee sign, then crosswalk, then the parking spaces are back here, so let's get those, and we can reset the track point size again, and right there. I could create a null as well, but solids are great because they're just so visible, and if I had nulls in here I wouldn't be able to tell so easily visually if they're sticking. Alright, that looks good. And then I want one more in the very back where I was cautioning about points being on cars. So I'm not going to pick any points that are actually on cars, but wow, I actually have to keep raising the size of these points so I can see them. And the size is a clue for where I'm getting points that are coplanar. Let's see if I can get a target that lays down. Well, that doesn't look so good. It's a little bit of a guessing game. Let me try this again. What I'm trying to find are 3 points, I'll zoom in, that are basically on the same plane, and I want them to be back in this intersection back here. So this is a little tricky. So let's see, that one's definitely on the corner of that building. The other building's on another block. Maybe instead I need this one, and that one, and maybe that one. The more points I choose, the closer I may get. Yeah, that's pretty good. I don't know why that's tweaking. So I can shift select and unselect. I don't know why it's tweaking so much, but I'm just going to create a solid right there and leave that alone. And that'll be good enough. I can, of course, select that solid, although it's hard to do right now. Oh, and I forgot to name these, so this one's going to be parking, and this one's going to be rear. And you can see by those arrows, which have a more precise name that I'm not thinking of right now, that these tangents, that's not right. Anyway, I can grab one and rotate just on that one, and then I'm just going to straighten this out while keeping it right there in place. So I'm carefully not changing its position. I just want it, and I mean, it doesn't have to be perfectly straight, but there we go. So that is a damn fine looking track. Look at all that perspective and parallax happening in there. I love it. Now it's time to add the real elements. Grab them from here. And there they are. So now to integrate them with the scene. And actually, there's one thing I neglected to do that I'm going to do now, and that is to check the scaling of the scene. So let's go back to my center point here, what I set as the origin of the 3D scene. Now what I want to do is basically, well, actually first let's check it. I'll add a new solid, and it will be comp size, and dark gray is fine. Let's call it ref and make it 3D. Let's see what happens. Okay, so scale wise it might be okay, but it's way down and to the left. So here's what I'm gonna do. Turn that off, and I'm gonna parent everything but crosswalk 2 to crosswalk 2. So the camera plus the other layers, I parent to that. Then I'm gonna go here, and there are its transforms. And I'm happy with most of what I see here, but I want this to be 0, and that doesn't affect things because I've moved the whole world around. And then I'm going to go for the center. So in this case, that is going to be 960, 540, 0. That's because we are in an HD world. Now let's just see if I turn this back on. Okay, now my added layer is centered, which is what I wanted. Now let's just look at scale for a second. So it has scaled it up a lot. So what I'm trying to do is get this solid to where it's basically filling the frame right here. And that's going to mean that as I add new elements, they're basically going to be proportionally the right size. Now, yes, technically, my anchor point on that layer that I added should be at 1080, so it's at the bottom. But what it allows me to do is simply add layers and set them to 3D, and they'll be the correct proportion at that 0 point. So I can now delete the reference. And I'm going to unparent everything. Now I no longer can add new solids to the scene because I've changed everything around from my camera track, but that's why I did them all first. So everything's back to looking the same, but now as I turn on 3D layers, let's just do that now, they are basically right there, right in the middle of the scene to start with, so I don't have a lot of awkward scaling and moving around to do at the start. Now, we just jumped straight into advanced use of the camera tracker, specifically not only setting the origin, but actually reorienting the world so that added 3D elements fall right into place. If that went a little fast for you, don't worry, this isn't the last time we're gonna do it. It's not the only way you can do it, but the basic principle is always to block in where you want representative solids or nulls or whatever you're using, and then rotate and scale the world so that as you add elements, they fall basically right around that origin and it's easy to place them. And you can also place them relative to those other solids or nulls that you've created, which is what we're going to do now. I don't need these on to do this. And I'll go one at a time. Let's start with coffee. And for that, I'll go into crosswalk 1, get its position. And before I paste it to coffee, let's just take a look at this layer. So I think I'd like my anchor point to be down at the bottom. And so now I'll paste position and scale that up a bit. Didn't really matter so much about placing the anchor point at the bottom in this case because I think I'm going to move it up anyway. I want it to look like it's at about head height. But you can see that we did things right because it really does look like it's sitting right in the middle of that crosswalk. So I'm just going to eyeball, moving it up there. And that might block my view a bit. But this one is arbitrary in terms of spacing, so I could move it a little bit closer without messing things up, move it down a bit, center it a bit more, and that's cool. I like that. Next is going to be the crosswalk sign and the crosswalk graphics. These graphics I know that I'm going to replace because right now they're faking their 3D-ness. So I'll just turn that one off for the moment and let's just work with the crosswalk sign for a second. So this one is going to get the position of crosswalk number 2. And there it is. And once again, it's going to look like it's sitting right on the ground plane. So I'll lift it up again a little bit. Actually, you know what? No, I won't. I'm going to leave it there. And let's just work on that crosswalk. So I'll make a pre-comp with the other one as a reference. And I'll call this crosswalk 3D. I know this is going to have to be wider. So let's make this about twice as wide, so it's not clipped at the edges. And the height, I'm going to stay with what I've got. What we're going to do is create a rectangle similar to the one you see here in the front. And I'm even reasonably close with the color already, but while it's selected, I can also sample from one of these neighbors. All right, well, I guess that's how it looks at full opacity. So now I have a shape layer and I want it to repeat both 2 and 3-dimensionally. There's no good way to make a 3-dimensional repeat like that. So I'm going to do that a different way, but I will add repeater right here. And if you haven't used this before, it's not as crazy as it seems. Under repeater, I have a transform, and by changing the position, I change how spread apart these guys are. So I'm going to match my reference, and then I want more of them. So rather than just 3 copies, I want 14. And on the overall shape, I'm also going to transform it. And this is why I widened my comp. So let's just see here if I'm still in bounds. We'll go with that. I'm also going to adjust them so that they're sitting right above the center line. And I'm doing that instead of moving the anchor point down. Let's see if they fit. Yes. Okay, great. So that will be that. I don't need the reference anymore. I think I'll just turn it off. And then how are we going to repeat it? On that crosswalk layer, just because it's there, I'm going to add an expression control, a slider, and I will call this Z offset, and I'll give it a default value of like 100. And now in the shape layer under position, we're not 3D yet, so let's change that. Let's set a position expression. Now expressions phobes, once again, don't panic. We're going to keep this really simple and use addition. So I'm taking the point that I have as the position, I'm adding a square bracket so I can hold values, and those values are going to be 0, 0, and then all I'm going to do is, I have to expose it though, and that's going to give me an error, so that'll make you afraid if your expression's phobic. But I'm going to lock this panel, go back here again, and what I was trying to do was pick whip up to that slider, and that is it. Now there's one other thing I want to do. So instead of just using that slider, which moved it back 100, you can see it there, I'm going to make that parentheses index -1, and then outside the parentheses times. And so for this layer, that's not going to move it at all because the index is 1, it's layer number 1, and so 1 minus 1 is 0, times 100 is still 0. Now, as I duplicate it, look what the heck is happening. And to make this more visible, let's give it a screen mode. Ooh, that's pretty sexy. All right, 10 is the number of layers. I don't know yet about whether 100 is the right depth. Let's go back to the assemble here, and let's give this the same, because I didn't do this already, give this the same position as the crosswalk sign, for now at least. So I'm pasting that and turning it on. Interesting. So right now it's not a 3D element because I have to collapse transformations to make it so. But that is something like what I was after. Now they look a little bit spread apart, so I have the option to change that. And they really are sticking to the ground though, and the reason for that is that I moved them up so that the anchor point of that pre-comp is right along the baseline, so they are correctly aligned. So if I'd gotten that wrong and the anchor point was in the center, then they'd be sitting half below the road and they wouldn't appear to stick as well. So we've got a little massaging to do on those. All right, I'm going to break down that elegant little expression that we just created because it's actually mathematically pretty simple, and most of what you're going to struggle with is just the syntax, the way it's typed out. We started, number 1, with transform.position. That's just the default expression, and all that's saying is look right back at the value that's already there for what to use here. So it changes nothing, it just loops right back to the value. That's because I wanted the initial value. The only one of those numbers I wanted to change, this is the third thing I did, was the final one, the Z number. Rather than set a value like 100, which would have been easy, what I did was put the 100 into an expression slider held on a different layer. Now that sounds gnarly, but an expression slider is just an empty effect, and its only job is to hold that value. So instead of typing in 100, I'm typing in 100 in an effect, where it's really familiar to all of us, and just using the pick whip to handle all that gnarly syntax of how to find that 100 sitting there by just dragging the pick whip straight to it. So at that point, I've offset my Z value by whatever that expression slider is holding. So there's one final thing I wanted to do, which was to have each layer have a different Z depending on where it is in the stack. And that's easy to do with the index value. And again, the only complicated thing here is the syntax. So now this is a little bit like algebra, where in parentheses, I wanted to subtract 1 from the index so that the one at layer 1, which is where it's getting its number, doesn't change. So 1 minus 1 is 0. And then outside the parentheses, I used an asterisk, the multiply, and I multiplied it by that value from the slider. And so 0 times the slider value is 0. And then 2 minus that 1 is 1. So the next one had that value. And then the next layer down is 3 minus 1 is 2. Multiplied by that value is another, in this case, 100 pixels further. The simplest thing to do here is first to just scale it down slightly. That'll be simpler than going in and adjusting everything in the other comp. Now I'm going to move up to where I can clearly see it. Cool. And let's work on the space between them, the depth of them that I had set that expression control for. I'll lock this comp and go back to the other one and adjust that control. Let's try 200. Ah, okay. Now I'm not going to get real-time interaction in a locked layer, so let's go back and yeah. It's really pretty good. Now if I want them to sit right in the front, there is a right and wrong way to even do that. And the way I'm going to repo each of these that I matched to a solid is actually to, this is going to seem weird, but I'm going to take the Crosswalk 3D layer and parent it for just a second to Crosswalk 2. And the reason for that is the direction that the controls are pointing. This one is flat to the camera, and this one, if I turn it back on, is just angled slightly differently. So can't really see that turned on, but let's try it like this. So in other words, that was aligned with the road, so if I move this one, it's not going to float up off the ground as I move it back and forth. It's a small detail, but let's see if I was right that that worked. Yep. And I am almost ready to move on to the next element. The other thing obviously that's wrong, quote unquote, here is that they're flat across and the road itself is a bit curved. I've got a great solution for that. I think the scale could still come down just a tad. Okay, my crosswalk, I'm gonna unlock my effect layer. And for crosswalk, go back to my old friend, mesh warp. Do the thing I love to do and set it to 2 and 2. And with these middle controls, I'll just take these 2 points and carefully just move them down. And then I can also carefully just make these, there we go. That's it. In case you thought I forgot about that slider I created, here's how I can interactively adjust it. I'm going to set a lock on my effect controls right here. Go back to traffic assemble, and let's say I want them to span the crosswalk. So I'll raise the value. It's not going to be interactive, but each time I release the control, I'll see an update. And there you have the benefit of my expression control. Now, if we're really going to get granular here, it looks like things are not totally planar with the front of the sidewalk. But there is a limit to what our AR system can do. Now I'm just going to make sure I go back and turn off those effect controls, and of course I will turn off the crosswalk again so that I can move on to the next step. For parking, there it is. I turned off the crosswalk so I could see it. It's obviously too small, but before I do anything, let's look at where that anchor point is. So the Y key, I'll just move it down. I mean, where is the ground plane when this is a fake 3D element? That's a little bit debatable, but I'll just go with the front edge. And then I'm going to copy position from my solid. That's where I want this thing to go. And then scale it so that it is filling those parking spaces. Wow. Needs to come over a little bit to the right. I'll go back to my pointer tool to just move it on X. And scale up a little more. And let's see how much it slides. Well, if you look closely, the parking spaces are sliding to the back of the space at the beginning and forward to the end. And you might think, uh-oh, how was there a problem with this track that I didn't notice? But it's not a problem with the track. In a case like this, you have to look at the element itself. So it's important to know the parking spaces were not slipping. What was happening was something completely different. So those P markers are exactly where they need to be. The parking spaces below them, rather than having a different front point and back point that would allow them to parallax, they're just fake perspective, and therefore as the angle changed on them, they didn't change. All right, this is gonna be fun. So rather than me waving my hands around, let me just show you that's what happens to flat perspective when you move it around in 3D space. We all knew that, but that is the problem we have to solve. To do that, I'll edit this layer from Illustrator. Command E will open that layer in the Illustrator file that's holding it, along with the rest of the file. And I'll just solo that one. And there they are. I'm gonna do it the tough way, or the tedious way, which is just to try different layers and find the one that has what I want to turn off. There it is. And I'll turn everything else back on and save it. Back over here, those parking spaces should now disappear. Wait for it. Finally. So now I will deselect and draw out something that looks like a parking space. I don't need to get the proportions perfect here because I'll be editing them. I already set the colors to match when I was practicing. I hope you don't mind. And I'll just lower the opacity to match what I had. And then make this layer 3D. It disappeared, but it's just back at the 0 point. And here is where my solid is going to come in handy. So the parking solid. Uber key reveals its position and orientation. I will borrow both of those, copy and paste them, not onto crosswalk, but onto that shape layer, which I really should also give a name. We'll call it parking space 1. And so number 1, we'll go over here. I hold down the shift key because I have to move quite a bit in 3D. That's a way to move longer distances. It's not big enough. That's not a perspective problem. I just need to make it longer, or at least I'm not going to treat that as a perspective problem. We're looking for something like that. Let's be careful to just scoot it along those axes, X and Y, that are right there on the street level. I can also rotate it around into place a little bit now that I have that perspective advantage. And now, having done that, let's get the other one in there. It's overlapping the car. That doesn't really bother me because I take that to be A, the way AR works, and B, something that's going to be covered up by the crosswalk for the most part. So that is going to be that. Let's just take a look and see if it now. Yep. So now those parking, oh, well, actually, it looks like I could place that one a little more carefully. So more like that. Awesome. Oh, I love it. And now I don't have that problem with them sliding around. All I have left to do is add the detour sign. We're going to use the position of that rear solid. That one back there. Copy, paste, turn that one on. It's very, very small. S for scale. And we'll just bring it right up like that. Looks great. Really, the only thing left to do here is just to get it out of monochrome land. And that's going to be done really simply with hue and saturation. All I really want to do is get a contrasting color happening. Something in the kind of yellow-orange range is what I have in mind. I could literally 180 the color, but I'm going to go a little bit more toward yellow. I like that. And then I'll copy that and let's apply it elsewhere as well. So that crosswalk sign. Also, this is going to be my signage color and my parking pointers minus the spaces, which will stay blue. And I guess the entire detour sign can also be that, and that pops a lot better. So now it's time to move on to the next shot of the runner. In order to go into a little bit more depth before I go further with the camera tracker, I wanted to show you this intermediate result, which is just a grid over the ground. But my God, look at that. Look how it caresses the exact contours of that path. Wow. Now, the thing that's very obvious with a grid over this is the grid is bent. This is a shot with lens distortion, and you might not necessarily peg that right away. So I want to show you what might be some signs that you're dealing with that. It is basically always visible, but sometimes your straight lines can look pretty straight until you look a little more closely. I have my comps in order here, so they are going, this is nested in here, that in there. And I'm going to go back to the source, which I put in its own comp, just so I could do a quick little demo. So I'm going to run Camera Tracker on here without having done any evaluation. Don't you want to go under camera? But no, it's under track and stabilize. Initially looking at the shot, like I said, you might notice, yeah, there's some curvature. There's a rolling hill over here. You know, well, now you can't unsee the lens distortion. But let's just suppose you got started on it without noticing or dealing with that. So here's what I would do with any track. Twirl down advanced, check that number. Average error is 1.75 pixels, and I had said anything above 1 is kind of a problem. There are some basic problems I would expect to see in the scene. One would be points sticking to my runner. So as I move my cursor around, you can see I have this giant track target and it's slanted. That's also a bad sign. But before we deal with that, let's just scan through the scene. You have to kind of drag the CTI back and forth, because if you press spacebar, those points go away. They're not sticking to him or really to his shadow. Look how his shadow sweeps through and actually, for the most part, gets those points out of the way, or they stick regardless. So you could mask him out, but for this one, we're not going to do that. So that's one thing I'd look for. Another thing I'd look for is just anywhere that the points look disproportionate. If you're having trouble seeing them, I can make the scene a little bigger, or you can always scale up the points themselves. And by default, in the 3D solved view, they are scaled according to how close they are to camera. If I switch to 2D, I need to make them a little bigger so you can see them. They're all the same size. And if you make them too big, they're really hard to deal with. But you're free to, you know, adjust that on the fly, just so you can see. And I don't see any giant points hanging around in what I perceive to be the background. That's one thing to watch out for. So in this one, that also is not a warning sign. So at this point, I'd be thinking, okay, what's the problem? And hopefully noticing that lens distortion. But let me just take it one more step further to show you something I didn't show you the last time around. And in the next shot we work on, the last of the 3, we're going to get to some of the things I just mentioned. So don't worry about that. I'm going to just reset that. And so let's say that I want to evaluate this by just putting down a solid. So I'm going to select points on both sides of the path so my solid can be in the middle. That looks just terrible. And let me make the target size at least a bit smaller. Now, this is already a warning sign that it's not laying down on the ground. It's a huge warning sign, actually. Let's just say that I want to set the ground plane. No, actually I'm not going to. I'm just going to create a solid in camera. And obviously it's tilted down. And if I want to see how it is, I can go to my custom view. And where's the solid? Let's go to a side view. Let's look at it from the right. Oh my gosh, the solid is way back there. It's this intensely long lens. And indeed, it's pointing at a weird angle. If you don't set the origin and ground plane, it won't appear orthographically horizontal. That is to say, it won't look flat in this view. All right, so I worked really hard on this lesson, and the first time around I walked through the whole process of discovering what I needed to do and doing a series of pre-comps. But what I'm going to show you now is actually the result. So what's missing here is the step of me pre-composing, because this process requires 3 pre-comps to do it. And you'll see it, but what you'll see is the innermost pre-comp on the right side. So that's my source layer. And then you'll see a larger comp that gets that one undistorted, and then another one where I re-distort that, but that's where I actually do all my assembly of my graphic elements. And then that goes into the final one on the right. So what we're skipping here when you do this is the process of pre-comping, which I know you know how to do, and I just decided it would be more expedient to show you the parts that you don't know. Getting to this result requires a series of comps, and I'm going to show you how and why that is. So here is the source plate back here, just as a reference, I think. Yep. And then a subcomp that matches it but has that grid over it, which was done here. Notice something's a little different. And then that one is actually just a guide layer nested into here. This will all be explained. And then finally, one layer deeper, we are back to just our source plate. Camera tracker's on there. That's the one I was just trying out with an average error of 1.67 due to the lens distortion. So here's what happens if I try to undo lens distortion just right on the layer. Optics compensation allows me to do that, and I reverse it to remove fisheye distortion. And as soon as I do so, the image is effectively cropped. Not what I want. So I'll remove that here. And to show you what happens next, let me actually get rid of my adjustments in here. So here now is that comp, and it was pre-comped into here, and then this comp only differs in that it is now 3200 by 1800 to make room. Now, when I apply optics compensation and reverse it, I still have the problem. So there's one more thing I have to do, and that is to make an adjustment layer that is the size of this entire comp, and I'll call it undistort. Now I'm straightening out the image without losing image data. Now how much? Well, I can eyeball it. These path lines should be straight lines, but I can't really use a grid since they're at an angle. So what I'm going to do is just make myself a linear shape layer, and let me just lay it right alongside. That's pretty close. By holding down the Option key, I can go in small gradations. I'm just going to go with 95. Okay, and I can keep this and either turn it off or make it a guide layer. And then I want all of this to then be what I track, but I can't apply the tracker directly to this layer because it's still distorted. So once again, I have to pre-comp into another comp the same size, which I've already done here. So let's reverse this out. I won't start over, I'll just turn off these layers. So my starting point is this comp brought in and then tracked. So camera tracker here had more success. Average error is just below 1. Good enough. Then by selecting points in that camera track, I created a solid and camera, which I'll turn on now. And those match the undistorted layer. And I applied a grid effect to that solid just so I can estimate how well it's sticking. And it looks really good. This is where I'm going to do my elements, and by do them I mean anything I want to do to them. That would be animate them, place them, but then also at the end re-distort them. So I just copied that same guide layer from over here, and the only difference is by toggling reverse lens distortion instead of doubling the amount of distortion, I'm undoing it. So anything I place below this adjustment layer is going to get distortion that'll match the scene, which is awesome. And then the reason that the bottom layer is a guide layer is because I don't actually want to take my background source, distort it, undistort it. Instead, I'm I'm just going to start with a fresh copy, and then above that is going to be everything that I'm comping in. Right now, just the grid. So that's the basic setup, and having done that, now I just comp in my elements in the undistorted scene underneath that adjustment layer. Now, rather than kind of noodle this together for this section, because you guys know about laying out graphics, I decided to go ahead and do it and then review what I did. So we're going to skip ahead now in time to when I was done, and I'll show you what I did. There's a couple non-straightforward things that I did in here. Everything is applied with screen mode, so that's cool. But the line is actually using a linear wipe effect. If I open that up, you can see that I'm animating a wipe across it, and so it's working as this really nice trick to just make the line follow my guy here. There's this weird wagon wheel effect kind of happening that's making it look kind of like it doesn't stick, but you're looking at different dots all the time. So if we look at that one dot right there, it's totally locked. It's just that you can't tell one dot from another. So what I could do in a future pass to avoid that would be to have a more transparent or maybe faint white dotted line extending to the other end of the frame that it's just filling in. One thing also about how I line things up at the beginning, if you look at my rotation here, it is a straight up 270. So it's exactly perpendicular and going right along the edge of the walkway. So that grid I started with and how I scaled the world around this really worked out. Now, one slightly more controversial thing perhaps that I did here was with the UI. I don't like the screen effect on the map, but that's not what I'm talking about. What I did, very simply, after thinking about how I wanted this to work, was animate the position straight across just in Z. So it's only animating in a straight line on the Z-axis. And the movement that you see on it is from the scene and the camera. This is sort of a poor man's Iron Man effect, where I have the heads up just responding a bit to the ambient environment while remaining legible. So I actually kind of like the way it came out. Don't know if it would fly with a client, but of course this would be a prototype of what their actual technology is supposed to do, so it would be a different conversation. And that leaves what turned out to be the trickiest, the cooking shot. Before I go into detail breaking down for you how I solved this shot, let's analyze. Obviously, we have some pretty strong fisheye lens distortion here. This appears to be a head-mounted GoPro shot that captured this. So the setup is going to be very much like with the running shot. I start with the source that goes into a larger comp, this time 4,000 pixels wide because it needed more undistortion. So I have my adjustment layer where I'm undistorting it, then I do my comping and tracking onto that undistorted layer and eventually reapply it back to the assemble comp. So if I track this scene, and I did do that here, there's another problem that you may or may not have also already noticed, but the tracker will make it very evident, and the average error is at 153, so it doesn't even look like there are any points right now. But if I scale them up a lot, and I mean a lot, you start to see them. And the reason that we didn't see them is because a few of them are very prominently in the foreground, and the scaling was done off of those. And those are the ones that are going to cause us problems because they are not on the background, they're on these moving foreground hands. And I can tell you that this track basically ended up following the hands when I left it this way. So anytime you have something like foreground motion that's messing up a track, you essentially need to use roto to remove it. And the question is, how good does that roto need to be? If you're lazy like me, you want it to be as bad as possible, which is a solid with a mask set to silhouette alpha blending mode. And this mask is so simple. It is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points, no animation, I was trying to do the least amount possible. You could roto the hands over time, but really I just wanted enough of this, and enough of this whole side of the scene that it would track. And basically it worked. The thing about taking the lazy approach is you have to be ready to test it out and back it up and make sure it works. And if it doesn't work, you're gonna have to suck it up and do better. In this case, the way to try it out was naturally to run the mask tracker, and specifically to make sure that there are points in each of those 3 areas on the cutting board that I pointed out, and that the overall quality of the track, the average error, is, well, high quality and low average error, which correlate. Now let's track it, and you can find the camera tracker under the perspective category instead of right-clicking on the layer, as you usually see me do. So let's observe the scene while this is tracking. There's a floor, which I don't need. There's a colander over here, which I'm not actually attaching anything to. My graphics are gonna go on the surface of the cutting board, so that's really what I care about. And I need to make sure that where I was sloppy with my masks, that doesn't cause a problem. So I could have probably done a lot more to be more precise, but I'm curious just what's gonna happen with this level of imprecision. So the first thing, of course, I'm scrubbing around and I do see some trackers out where I don't need them. Let's take a look. The average error is 1.59, not very good. I did practice, so I do kind of know what I'm looking for. And there's a couple things. Before I start going in and deleting individual tracking points, I want to affirm there are tracking points showing up in my 3 areas of the cutting board, including tomatoes and so on. That's great. Then what I want to draw your attention to is this colander. Now, not only is this not part of my motion track, i.e. I'm not trying to track anything onto this surface, something really weird is going on up here. See how small those points are? Let me make all my points just a little bit larger. Now you can clearly see those are smaller up there. Well, that, what it's tracking, I think those are ceiling lights. And so they are actually farther away. So the tracker is actually getting that right. But look at that teeny little point there. Now I could delete these here, but there's a simpler option from the start, which is just to mask the top of that colander out. I could mask out the whole colander, but I would caution you against eliminating something like that, because this is really helpful to the camera tracker if it gets it right. So I just want to eliminate the part it's not getting right. And again, I'm going to do it the lazy way. Let's see if I just got rid of all that top. Yep. Having done that, this means that I do need to now retrack it just to get rid of those points instead of deleting them. And I would encourage you to actually delete the tracker rather than reset or do something clever, because I've seen that backfire. The info seems to hang around sometimes. Let's do it from the right click position this time. And the moment of truth. Average error is marginally better. Just because those points were wrong for the scene doesn't mean it wasn't tracking them properly. Now I'm just going to sweep through and get rid of the pixels down here in the corners. Let's make them a little bigger so I make sure I can see them. I'm going to go ahead 10 frames at a time. And already that improved my average error, just deleting that one. That improved it again, so I think I'm on the right track. What you're watching now is the greatest hack, or one of them, to the camera tracker, where by deleting points, I'm gradually eroding away at the average error until I get it into an acceptable range. So those points are throughout the scene. I can't just delete them in one place. I have to go find them throughout, maybe every 10 frames or so. But deleting them is gradually reducing the average error. So at some point I mentioned that Camera Tracker was designed to be a one-button tool. Now what we're doing is kind of hacking that. And we're going into the advanced controls, which implies we're ready to hack. We're keeping our eye on that average error, and we're seeing if it makes a difference, since we're really only caring about that one plane where the cutting board and the colander are, and not about the floor. What happens if we eliminate those? Because they're gonna have much more error. They're also from the most distorted areas of the shot. If I were deleting these and I weren't seeing an improvement, I would move on and just try to make do with the lower error. But lowering the error is going to make the points that are left work better. This time around, I am going to take a look at my reference. So we're putting an element down here, one up here, one over there, and then there's one dead center that I guess has got to be a little higher up off the surface here. So let's see if I can get myself a target right in the middle. I don't want the tomatoes though. So I'm going to choose points that are right on the surface. That one looks a little odd. Actually, let's get rid of that. And sometimes you get rid of one point like that and you see a huge difference in the average error, and in that case, no. So I think we're close to where we want to be already. So that's cool. The target is very small, and the target size is going to result in the size of the solid. I'm going to be scaling everything anyway, but let's just make it decent size. And that is where I'm going to set my ground plane and origin, and then create my solid in camera. And then with that still selected, let's also get a few more solids. We want one over there, one over here, and what happened to my points over here? There we go. One right there. Great. And I'll label these. This is going to be music. This is my music player. Okay, that's my steps up here. And this guy, this is my center. All right, you know the drill. Once again, having done all that, I'll add a solid at my target frame size, 1920, 1080, and let's see what happens when that becomes 3D. Oh, where'd it go? Okay, so one thing right off the bat, it is facing the wrong direction. So let's fix that. This guy is going to have everything else except for that layer parented to it, like so. And so the first thing I want to do is rotate it on X. So I'm going to reveal rotation, make my timeline a little bigger. Shift S for scale, Shift P for position. So position should be the center of this comp. That is going to be 2000 and 1125. So half the height and width. I'm going to interrupt with a quick hypothetical here. Should the center be the center of the expanded, stretched out shot, or the center of the final shot? Really, the only reason we're doing this is when we put elements into the scene, they are placed more or less where we want them. So previously you saw me use the target frame, but you also probably noticed things came over to the left. So that probably wasn't the right decision. Here, I'm using the actual center of this comp. So I think that's probably going to work better, but we'll see. So normally, let me see if I can explain this. So our ground plane is facing us this time. It's not down where the ground would usually be. So green pointing up is usually correct for a ground plane, but this is more like a back wall because we're pointed down. I don't know how else to explain that. But anyway, we're tracking to what is flat to the screen. So in this case, we want the green arrow to point away. I'm just going to aim at the x-axis and rotate it with shift down to constrain it to 90 degrees. I can see that it's now 90 degrees lower, and I was rotating it clockwise, so that should now lay it down. Let's turn on my reference. Yes, my reference is now facing the correct way, and it's just way too small. So here I will scale down and being careful. And here it would be helpful to turn on my undistort and turn off my grid. Okay, that's pretty good. Let's see, what did I do wrong? Yeah, the position of this was not set properly. This should have been 1125. There we go. Okay, whew. So let me just review what I just did. Uber key. I set the position after parenting everything except for my reference to my center, which I have set to a solid. I set the position to half of this comp. I set the orientation 90 degrees so that my reference would be facing us, as I want the elements to do. And then, most importantly, I scaled the entire scene so that this solid is roughly the same size as my target frame. And I don't really need these turned on anymore. And I no longer need to parent everything to anything but itself. And finally, I'll turn the distort back off to position my layers to the undistorted background. Once again, we're going to skip ahead, and rather than watch me noodle these layers into place, since they're basically static, I'm going to show you the final and what I did. Here, I really actually just put things in at the exact position and rotation of those solids that I had laid in here. So you can see they're basically in the same place. I think this guy had to move on to the cutting board a little bit, and I had to parent that close-up of a mushroom so everything would move together there. But everything here really good. And one thing I will also call out in all of these is I'm not enabling motion blur. So I decided that the UI would not have that, even though that would match the scene better. Oh, and one other thing, the knife here, I did elevate that above the surface so that there's a little bit of parallax, not a ton. So that's all really looking good. And then when I went to preview the final for you guys, there was a problem. And to show you that, let me go in here and under advanced, okay, that's unchecked. I'm gonna go in this one as well. So I'm gonna uncheck this, which I had to add to fix this problem. But let me show you what I saw. Those foreground layers that were sticking perfectly are not. What? And in my experience, that could only be a frame rate mismatch. Well, I'm so embarrassed to say, there it is. The source frame rate was 25 FPS, and it was just carried through. We can look at the clips. This is a PAL clip, or something maybe that the stock footage house did. They often standardize to this frame rate. In any case, it's something I really should have caught. And at this point, I'd finished everything. So what do? Well, I'm going to use this as a teachable moment to show you a fix. By enabling preserve frame rate when nested back here in the main comp, we have fixed the problem. Now, it's not that simple, right? Because it's now at the wrong frame rate. So if you notice, and you may have noticed this already, there are a couple of extra frames here at the beginning, because what I ended up doing was retiming this layer. 25 down to 23,976 is 4.17% slower, but that 976 is for syncing sound. Over this short of a clip, that's not really an issue, so I just rounded that to 4%. I hope you forgive me for that. And then that retime layer shortened my whole thing by 2 frames. Now, there are a bunch of ways I could fix that, and I did the one that would probably be the least acceptable to any client, which was actually to trim the entire work area 2 frames shorter and retime the audio. And it worked, so that's what I did. But again, the key there was to enable preserve frame rate so that in between frames in that motion track were not considered. Otherwise, what it's doing is taking the motion of the camera and generating new in-between motion that then causes things to slip and slide. So the bad news is I screwed that up and it looked wrong. The good news is I knew exactly what had happened, and now you will too if it happens to you. So there's only one part of this sequence that we haven't looked at, and that's the ending shot, which doesn't have any tracking, but does have a little comping and MoGraph. Let's take a look. There's not a ton to show here. The main thing added was plussing up this effect on the glasses. I broke one of my own rules from early in the course by applying linear dodge to the clear and blue layers. If I just solo those plus the plate, you can see the effect of that. And it bears out my point that these don't actually really work for video, but here we're going for something weird. And when I say don't work, that suddenly looks like a print image to me. You're free to disagree. Of course, I have some shapes. In addition, I didn't animate themselves, I just animate the timing in order to make this little thing happen. And it all occurs over just a few frames, just a little hint. And then the only other thing happening, there was a request to have the logo pop a little bit. For this, I need to unsolo things. And so for that, I just inverted the logo and URL layers and added a fast box blur horizontal, animated that so that it basically just subtly kind of spreads out and back. I would call that a quick solution to the request to make the logo pop. Of course, it's one of many different decisions or choices one could make about that. So you've seen all the pieces. Let's take a look at the Spot version 1 as it is all together.
Your own private tour guide, coming soon.